Hello, and thank you for joining us for another Architizer live webinar. If this is your first session with us, welcome. And if you've attended one of our previous sessions, welcome back. It's so great to have you with us again. I'm Paul Keskeys, Editor-in-Chief at Architizer, and today I'm delighted to welcome back the brilliant Roderick Bates to explore the latest findings from our global survey on AI in architecture. By now, you've no doubt tested the tools, read 1,000 AI-related posts, journeyed through the inevitable existential crisis and out the other side. So now it's time to level set and ask, how are architects really using AI in practice? This is the big question Architizer and Chaos asked with our latest collaborative survey and report. And the findings are fascinating, as Roderick will reveal today. While we wait for the room to fill up, you know the drill. Some of you are already doing it. You can say hi in the chat box on the right side of your screen. Let us know where you're from, and share if you're an architect, designer, or another member of the AEC community.
I think, Paul, you also mentioned maybe people can note if they've seen some of these other ones. I believe this is our 4th time that we've done this.
Absolutely. Let us know if you have come to one of our previous AI talks, and later on maybe share, what stood out to you as a big change or a trend that you've noticed. So most of you are familiar with our live platform already, but for anyone who's new, there's a few quick tips on the screen. If you're having any technical difficulties with your stream, a quick refresh of your browser resolves things 99% of the time. Otherwise, you can click on the help icon in the bottom left and find some options for improving your picture, the sound, and so on. We welcome and encourage questions from our audience for these webinars. So if you have one for Roderick, click on the questions tab in the bottom right of your screen next to chat and type it there so it's not lost in the chat and can be saved for the Q&A session a little bit later on.
Absolutely. And I like the hard questions. So don't go easy on me, please.
Bring it. more complicated and existential, the better. So feel free to hit those emoji reactions whenever you see or hear something you like or you find interesting. So now I'm delighted to welcome today's speaker. Roderick Bates is the Senior Director of Product Operations at Chaos. Throughout his career, Roderick has sought out and developed solutions to environmental challenges related to the design, construction, and operations of buildings. At Chaos, his responsibilities include tracking industry and market trends and leading strategic partnerships with the global objective of empowering Chaos customers. And with that, I'll hand over the mic to Roderick.
Oh, that's great. Well, you said the brilliant. I'm going to remember that one because I don't hear that often enough, let me tell you, or really ever.
Oh, you're brilliant. It's true.
Thanks. Appreciate it. So as long as I can figure out how to start the slideshow, and I hope that everyone can see it. All right. Looks good.
Looks great.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, then I'm going to take this away and get right into it. There's a lot of content, but honestly, it's all incredibly interesting. So I think you'll find it quite exciting. Fortunately, I can skip this slide because I had that wonderful intro. Thank you very much. But let's go to the next piece here, which is to note that you can get your hands on the actual report itself. So this is a summary of key insights from, well, my perspective that I thought were particularly interesting. But there's a lot of other data in there. So I would certainly encourage everyone to actually download that full report. I'm sure that'll be available in any follow-up that's associated with this webinar. But you can see there's other different topics that are addressed in here. Ones are looking how, why firms might be avoiding AI in their design workflows, why they're actually using it, where are they using it in particular, what stages of design are they seeing the most value, things like that. So a lot of good data in here, and something that we take a lot of care in formulating the questions for this every year. And I think you'll find it to be incredibly valuable. The other thing that honestly has me so excited is the fact that this is the 4th time that we've done this. Now, we haven't always asked exactly the same questions, but they're pretty close. And so from my perspective, this is starting to become, and maybe not even the intent at the time, but it's become this incredible artifact tracing the trajectory and rise of AI in AEC visualization. It's really barely a glimmer in people's eye there in July in 2023. And that's, of course, when it was released. So that survey happened even earlier in the year. So being able to track this, I almost feel like this has become like a historical touchstone because we're really seeing the rise of a new technology, and that doesn't get to happen too often. And the fact that we have these surveys at very regular intervals throughout this entire time period, to me, something I find incredibly exciting. So who are the people that are responding to this survey? It's an enormous number of people, 800 or so individuals, which is honestly quite a few. And I really have to take my hat off to Architizer for helping us get connected to all of those folks to take the survey. And what we're finding is a real diversity of different types of firm sizes. And that's one of our key goals. We want to reflect the whole industry, not just sort of one sector of it. So you can see we have some of the largest firms, right? 100 plus employees. That is a very large firm, but we also have a lot of freelancers as well. And then we have firms that are probably a little bit more normal in the size, 1 to 5 employees, 6 to 19 employees. So a really nice distribution. Although we are seeing a slight shift towards more of the medium-sized firms, which actually I think is a good thing. That's a sector of the market that I always want to encourage, and I find some of the most exciting work really happens at medium-sized firms. And then we're seeing a little bit of a decrease in small firms and freelancers. So hopefully that's not reflective of anything larger in the industry, just sort of the ebb and flow of those that are participating. Now, as far as the respondents themselves, we always, of course, want to track their responses with respect to their specialization. And far and away, architecture is the primary here. There's a slight decrease in architecture from past surveys, but not much of one. But there is a larger decrease in interior design, which I thought was somewhat surprising. Obviously, that's a strong market segment. But what we did, however, is pick up a new category which I think is very exciting and one that's quite relevant to chaos, which is rendering and visualization. So about 16% or so of the respondents fall into that particular category. But what I like about this, though, is that we have a lot of different categories represented. And that's exactly what it takes to design and deliver a building, a lot of different skill sets. And all of them are going to need visualization in some way, shape, or form. So having them all represented in the survey responses, from my perspective, is a great thing. Okay. So that's a little bit of background on the survey. And we like to do that so you can understand the richness of the data and the breadth of it and really the applicability of that data perhaps to your particular circumstance. But the point of all of this, of course, is starting answering some real questions. And one of them is, well, how widespread is AI in architecture? And what are we actually seeing? And we're seeing a pretty dramatic increase in the number of firms that are actively using AI. So the people that are actively using AI were at around 60% in total, the firms. And that's an interesting number to look at because when you look at from our first survey, we had about 20% of the firms were actively using AI. So it's a dramatic increase in the number of firms that are using AI, and certainly a very steady growth that we're seeing. Up 38% for 2023, up 14% for 2025. So just a nice increase. And I suspect by the time we do this next year, that will be pretty darn close to 100%. But what's particularly interesting is how the firm size breaks down to AI use. And this is something I found a little disconcerting depending upon the lens that you might apply to it. But when it comes to the primary users of AI in practice, it's larger firms. Either they're actively embracing it or they're experimenting with it. However, as you start to go down into smaller firms, we're seeing a lot less of the active embracing, maybe a mid-size and things like that. But you go down to the 16, 19 employees, only 11% of them are actively embracing it. And from my perspective, I can certainly understand why there's costs, there's sort of a lack of knowledge, but this also, in my opinion, represents a risk. The firms that are using it are seeing real benefits, which we'll get into later. And those that aren't using it, of course, are going to be missing out. And it makes me a little nervous about some of these smaller practices that haven't necessarily felt comfortable enough with AI to start actively embracing it. So adoption is going to continue to grow for sure. So those numbers are always going to be shifting and likely shifting upwards if people's sentiment is anything to go by. So 74% of the people that took that survey said they were likely to see an increase in AI use in the next 12 months. And I'd say that's probably pretty accurate. If there's ever a safe bet, this is probably it. But when you look at the breakdown here, we have the number of people that are likely, very likely, right? That's a big chunk there. But even though that that are neutral, it's not necessarily small, but those that are very unlikely, 3%. I would love to do a deep dive with those folks and find out exactly what's happening in those particular practices. But you can see really the overwhelming majority, likely or very likely. But what was interesting is we were able to do a little bit of a dive on the data here, is that even amongst those that are actively avoiding AI, they say, I don't want nothing to do with this. 10% of them admitted, well, they might have to capitulate in the future, and increase use. So it's something where the inevitability of AI in the context of practice is certainly increased. And I think it's worth noting that AI doesn't mean in some ways sort of turning your full workflow, of course, over to automation. There's a number of much smaller ways in which can be implemented. And Paul and I were chatting before we started this webinar that, in some ways, the lowest threshold of AI is autocomplete when you're texting, right? There's various shades of AI, if you will, and gradients of it. And at the lower level, it's quite modest. And I imagine that 10%, or perhaps even are using AI today and not fully appreciating that fact. So let's look at some of the investment priorities that firms have. Where are they thinking about going next? Where are they going to be putting their money? So it's one thing to say, well, we're pretty confident we're going to be increasing AI usage, but AI is a big category. What's it going to be? Well, the number one thing, which of course is hugely interesting to us at Chaos, being uh, one of the world leaders in AI or in visualization, is AI assisted and AI generated renderings. So what's interesting about this is that for the first time now, that figure exceeds those that plan to increase investment in photorealistic visualizations. The photorealistic visualizations, things that you might be able to do with, say, V-Ray software and things like that, used to be the number one, and was for a number of years in these surveys. So seeing that shift is quite interesting. And then seeing real-time rendering, which also used to be right up there at the top, move down a bit, is pretty fascinating. So clearly, when it comes to investment, people are seeing AI-assisted and AI-generated renderings as a big, big priority over the coming year. So when we think about that, we're like, okay, well, really, what are we talking about with AI assisted or AI renderings? What does it actually look like? So I wanted to give an example here that actually really combines a couple of those different elements here when you look at people's priority with our own Veris software. So we have an integration that goes right into all the various CAD programs that people will be using in the course of their design process. It also actually integrates with our traditional rendering tools because sometimes you need a little bit of an AI touch up and things like that. But here's an export directly from SketchUp. And this is what you can do via prompt. You can see that prompt on the right, and those are prompts that we actually have pre-formatted because becoming a prompt engineer is a lot to ask of someone. So you can see when you look at this particular hierarchy that you're actually able to achieve two of those things pretty easily. Photorealistic quality, and maybe it's not photorealistic in the sense of you can tune this to be exactly your project and respond to targeted client feedback in a way that you could say with traditional rendering software like V-Ray, but you can create a pretty compelling visual from a viewport output directly from your modeling software. But what's even more compelling, if you looked at that list, people were mentioning other capabilities, and it's good to say, okay, well, how are we actually using that type of capability potentially in our practice? And that's exactly what people are doing. They're using image generation for model inputs. That's 40% of them. So that really hues with what I just showed you in that particular example with Veris. There's a fair number that are actually doing image generation from text prompts, which honestly surprised me somewhat because you can oftentimes be a little surprised when you do a text prompt. Oftentimes, I find the best results be one that where you have an image reference image and a text prompt simultaneously, and you use those two components together. But you look at some of the other capabilities here, image enhancing, things like that, or video generation from text or image prompts. That's something that probably wasn't, I don't even think that was even on the list and the previous one. But now you can see, that's really popped up right there at the fourth place when it comes to what people are doing currently with AI. There's some other interesting workflows there, like building code analysis, material generation, and things like that. But looking at those top items, you're starting with that model input. So let's say an example. We can walk through one here from Revit, same project that we saw earlier. And then you can take that potentially into Enscape, and you see a view like this, which looks, it's a very effective way of understanding that Revit model. But if you combine that with AI, you can get something that completely aligns with your design intent from respect to materials, the orientation of the view that you want to have, the the lighting, and all of that can actually be very much so intentionally controlled. And in the context of our larger ecosystem, you can also start to add in other capabilities, like making it into a short video. And then you can take multiple short videos and actually start to create a fairly compelling narrative for a client. And when you think about the traditional workflows that something like that would take, it's not insignificant, right? You're talking about a whole other modeling program that you might have to use to do that type of animation, extended rendering times associated with it. And here's something where very quickly using AI, you can go from a model input to a high quality visual output and then add animation. But what's even more interesting, and this is something that's a proof of concept that we have, is that you can actually use a video, an AI generated video like you just saw, to train what we refer to as a Gaussian splat. So that's almost like a full world environment that you can actually navigate, that is a combination of almost like LiDAR and photogrammetry. So it's very lightweight, but it allows for you to really get a sense of this project. And this is navigating in real time in the context of a splat. So like I say, this is sort of right off the developer's bench. But I thought it'd be fun to show this and show you some of the things that we're evolving as far as our next generation of technology. But when it comes to capabilities, this is a far cry from really what you could potentially have been able to do from just an AI image. An AI image is one view. You can't navigate it. You can't see a different perspective. And yet we're able to go from an AI image to an AI video to a Gaussian splat that you can actually navigate. So what do people want? If that's where we are today, and say, okay, well, that's pretty interesting stuff. But what do people want as far as what's next from AI? Where does the technology need to evolve from people's perspective, from the user's perspective? Well, one of them is that people want to be able to generate 3D assets, tables, chairs, maybe people from a reference image. Assets are one of those things that people always want more of. We have a library of, I think something like 30 some odd thousand assets at this particular point, and that's still not enough. There's always some asset that people need. I remember talking to someone that was doing a children's hospital, and they needed a lot of kids for that particular uh, project. Well, that was something we simply did not have enough of, for instance, in our asset library. In addition to that, people want greater control over their output images. And I certainly can understand that. Oftentimes AI is really close, but not quite right. And when you want to make targeted improvements, oftentimes you get sort of unintended artifacts, and it can be incredibly frustrating. And then you can see some of the other ones there. Number three, you can convert 2D images to a 3D scene. And actually, I think I showed you a pretty compelling proof of concept where we're looking at doing exactly that. But you can see some of these other categories that people have, greater ability to generate planning or construction documentation. People really want to push the capability of AI pretty far. as far as what they want. But ultimately, I think this number one item, and it's been number one for a really long time when it comes to AI wish list, which is they want to have more control over the AI itself. They really like the speed advantage, but that speed advantage starts to erode pretty quickly if you have to do a lot of iterations. And now, since AI is sort of in a more mature phase, there's usually a cost associated with all those iterations. And that cost can add up quick if you're having to throw out tons and tons of AI generated images because they're just not quite right. So, what is a solution to some of these things? Well, one of them, of course, was the request for asset generation. This is something that we'll be coming out with this quarter in our Cosmos material library is 3D asset generation. So you can have an input image, and then from that input image, you can generate a series of high quality, well, actually not a series, just a high quality asset. This is something that will be going into beta in May. I'm pretty excited about the examples. Actually, you're seeing a real example right here from this. You can see that the quality is incredibly high. So really a nice feature and capability that we know that people are going to make heavy use of. Now, when we look at the phases in which people are using AI, uh, the most demand is early on in projects. And that's really not necessarily a surprise, right? Conceptual and pre-design and things like that. But there's also demand to start to see it later in design. Construction documentation, and you saw that earlier in people's wish lists, and that makes a lot of sense. But there really aren't any effective tools, or there are not too many, I should say, effective tools in that particular context. There's actually one within our ecosystem. But then you can also see that there's a desire to start using the tool in design development and schematic design as well. And so for many people, I think within all of these, they see an opportunity to start to eliminate repetitive tasks. And I think if you've been on any other AI webinars, you've probably heard similar messages, right? AI can do the boring stuff, automate the boring stuff, and I think that's absolutely true. And there's many components of construction documents in particular that could certainly fall under that particular category. So if you look at those different applications that people are seeing, one of them is that early design, concept design, rapid iteration. So here's an example of what you're able to do with our Veris AI visualization software. If you want iterations, you can do iterations. There's no doubt about it. You can just do them of all different types. Everything that may be highly speculative, very provocative, to those that are very buttoned down and more reflective of an actual context. But this is something where, for a lot of clients that want to see different ideas, want to explore, maybe just to start to feel comfortable with iteration and new directions to develop the design. This is a very powerful capability. But obviously, that's not the same as construction documents. In fact, it's almost the complete opposite. So our Glyph software is something where it uses AI in the context of developing construction documents and various tasks associated with construction documents, whether it be dimensioning, sheet packing, things like that. All of these various tasks can actually be bundled into multi-step workflows so that you can go from a Revit model through to a documentation set incredibly quickly. And something that I was astounded to find when speaking to customers that have really embraced Glyph workflows is that they're not seeing, a couple hours savings here and there on projects, particularly those with a high level of repetition, say like a hotel or something like that. They're literally seeing weeks of time savings associated with using this to expedite documentation. And so this is a tool that I'm really excited about. One of the things that we're making a big push for in this quarter is to allow for the training of this tool based off of a firm's documentation set. So you're not, say, trying to train it to generate a set via prompt that looks like yours. You can actually use your own set, your own standards, and use that to train this so that its output actually aligns with what your firm has as its standard. But if we go beyond, say, documentation, you probably remember there are two things in there where people are saying, hey, schematic design, design development, where can I use AI? Well, what are you doing during those stages? Well, you're doing a lot of modeling. So this is a really interesting example that we have. This is actually a functional proof of concept. We just put some text here to make it more legible, but you're able to go from Revit into our Morphus interface. And the Morphus interface via a text prompt or an uploaded image, in this case, you can create, say, a lighting layout. And then that lighting layout, you can now push back as Revit geometry. So it's actually a Revit family. It's recognized within there. And you can see on the left, you're able to visualize it in our Enscape software. And what's really neat about this, you can see in the Enscape, right? It's, it's dark out, no lights at all. But you can push lights. So this is actually, you're seeing this is how fast the whole program works. You see like that layout and how you bake it, and then you're able to push it back to Enscape. And what's really neat is now that it's in Enscape, you can manipulate it with all the capabilities that are built into our Enscape software. So this is like almost a best of both worlds example where you're using AI to very rapidly create geometry, push that back into Revit where it can be very laborious. But of course, if it's in Revit, you can also adjust it to be just right. But then if you want to create the visualization, um, you can, from Enscape, take what was automatically created and then adjust the lights, so they're just so. They look a little bit better for the view that you want to do, maybe to share with a client or what have you. So really powerful AI, non-AI hybrid workflow, and one that I'm really excited about, and something that we're happy to share. Like I said, this is very much so from off the developer's bench, but it's at the same time something that all pulls from existing software and will be, if receptivity is positive, released in short order. So is AI meeting expectations? That's a great question to ask. And I think with 800 people responding, we're starting to get a pretty good sense of like, okay, is this actually an improvement or not? And what we're seeing, in fact, is that satisfaction's a little mixed. In some cases, people are somewhat satisfied, but ultimately, the usefulness is inconsistent. We do have 19% of the people, though, that are very satisfied. And you say, okay, where are those 19% pulling from? Are these people that are new to using AI or just experimenting with it? And we cross-reference the data. We found that those that are most satisfied with the function of AI are those that have essentially fully embraced it. And I think what this indicates is that as you use AI, you understand its limitations, you understand its opportunities, and you start to work with them more effectively. I was on a podcast recently where the guest described AI as an overeager intern. And sometimes that overeager intern does fantastic work, really impresses you. And sometimes you need to tell them to slow down a little bit and think a little bit harder and maybe take some other factors into consideration. But there's no doubt that a overeager intern can also be very useful. So I think for those that are very satisfied, they found out where those useful points are. I think that's one of the key aspects of AI is that in order to find that usefulness, you actually do need to really engage with it. And if you just dip your toe in the water, you're likely going to be a little unimpressed. That 1% that's very unsatisfied, I imagine they tried something once, they're like, this is a joke, and walked away. But I think for those that try it more, learn its weaknesses, learn its strengths, their satisfaction goes up quite a bit. So, what are the biggest challenges that people have? Well, it's the same ones actually that we've been seeing all along. No surprises. It's quality and reliability. So this is consistently showing up throughout these surveys where we've been asking about AI. What are the challenges that people have? And certainly in the early days where you were using text prompts to try to get an output image, and that was your only mechanism, it's really not a surprise that people are having issues with quality and reliability. But now, as there's more robust capabilities, I think that probably those that are citing this haven't necessarily used the latest functionalities and tried to leverage them to start to deliver more consistent quality as far as the visual outputs. The other one is poor integration with existing software. And I can certainly appreciate this. If you're using certain tools, there's a lot of downloads, there's a lot of uploads and things like that. And that's something that we feel is one of the real strengths of our ecosystem at Chaos is that it's all integrated. Whether you're talking about a credit system, which will be rolling out, where the way that you might be using credits is consistent across the entire ecosystem, or you're talking about how you're able to transfer data from, say, an AI tool into a traditional rendering tool, or traditional rendering tool into an AI tool. That type of integration is incredibly important. But that first one, the poor output quality and unreliable results, let's that one I think is certainly appreciate that continues to prove a challenge. And that gets to this idea of like, well, do I need to watch what AI does? And well, yeah, I think just about everyone says in some way, shape, or form that AI requires supervision. So there's really at this point no one that says you can just let AI rip and not worry about it. Everyone says that almost everyone says, you need to have some designer or expert eyes on it to interpret these results. There's 17% there. It says it's clear and they're well controlled, and they're not sure they need supervision. I'm impressed. I don't know exactly what they're doing. I always find like it's great. You can trust it, and it's great 90% of the time. And then that 10% of the time is the time that you don't check it. So I would always say that probably that 70% is really quite right. That it does things pretty darn well, but still requires some level of supervision or oversight. And I think this gets to the fact that ultimately architects are responsible for everything that goes out the door. So one of the first elements there of like, okay, this quality and control that people want, where are some of the ways that we at Chaos are trying to do that? So here's an output from our real-time rendering software, Enscape. And you can see, the quality isn't perfect necessarily, but you can use AI to bump up the quality, gets things a little bit more realistic looking. But the downside is the lady on the left looks really happy. She's enjoying herself. And the guy on the right looks like he's watching a terrible movie that he's not enjoying. And so is this a place where you can start to use AI to actually sort of bring things back and start to correct things in a way that aligns a lot more with your intent? So one of the nice things about using AI in an integrated ecosystem is that we actually have masks that are applied to all of the AI outputs, recognizing the source, in this case from the rendering software, recognizing the various components. In this case, you can recognize that this is a person's face and that it's an adult and it's a male. And from that, we can start to adjust various parameters to make it align with the overall scene or your design intent and things like that. So maybe you wanted to change the ethnicity, you could do that. But in this particular case, what I really want to do is just change the facial expression. Pretty targeted, right? And I don't want to change anything else. I think everything else looks pretty good. So you can actually do that. So you're seeing the interface that we have through our software where you can select that individual, select their face, change the facial expression, and then go through an enhancement mechanism where you have now him smiling. And so now it looks like they're both sharing the same movie, the same reality. They're happy. But this shows an example where you can, through an integrated ecosystem where you're starting to share metadata across tools, be able to much more readily control AI and not just be sort of at the whims of what AI might be creating. So, what benefits are architects seeing from AI? If we're starting to see, people have opportunities for more enhanced control, we're starting to see them use it more for visualization. What are the actual benefits that they're realizing? Are they actually seeing anything that's actually coming out of this when it's starting to look at the bottom line? And yes, we are really starting to see that. So for the first time in our surveys, we're tracking the time savings associated with the use of AI. And what we're seeing here at this point is that AI is absolutely delivering time savings. Essentially, 86%, 9 out of 10 of the AI users report time savings. So that's pretty massive right there, because that was always the promise of AI, is that it's going to make things more efficient. You're going to save time. You can focus that time on other tasks. And we're now starting to see that happen, which is incredible for a technology that's only a few years old. So, if we look at this, and there's a little bit of a spread, for the majority of people are saying, yeah, we save time on certain tasks, but maybe not everything. And then there's others that have said, yes, it's significantly sped up our workflow. But you can see when it comes down to those that, aren't actually seeing much of a benefit, it's starting to get to the single digits. So more people are seeing a benefit than not. And I'm actually rather curious, for those that are saying it creates more rework than benefit. I think there's probably one of those situations where they haven't found the right way necessarily to apply AI. But when it comes to those time savings, one of the things that I wanted to do with this particular survey was actually start to get down to hours level figure. I'm really interested to know, what are we actually talking about when it comes to the users here? What are they actually seeing as far as time savings? Are we talking an hour a day, 2 hours a day, something like that, or is it something even more? And we're able to cross-reference that against firm sizes. And so what we're seeing here is that for the really large firms, they're saving 0 to 5 hours. So, let's say it's at that 5 hour side, less than more so than the zero. That's still pretty significant, right? That's not a small chunk of that 40-hour work week. 15 or so percent of their time savings. That's not insignificant. But then if you start to look at smaller firms, the mid-size 50 to 100, 20 to 49, 6 to 19, you can see in there that a lot of them are saving 5 to 10 hours per an AI user, which is not insignificant. That's real time at that point. That's time that enough to put a lot more effort into a design process, maybe increase the amount of scope that you can take on, things like that. So when I saw those figures, I was really impressed by that. And then it's trying to see also that there's a not insignificant number of people that are seeing real time savings, like more than 15 hours a week, which is remarkable. I mean, that's incredible. I remember having a uh, cab customer advisory board meeting several years ago, and there was someone from a major AEC firm that said, we don't want AI that just delivers marginal improvements, a couple percent here or there, nibbles around the edges. We want to see big time savings. We want to see that 25% or so time savings. And I think we're starting to see that now, which is incredible. And it's the medium-sized firms that seem to be realizing the most savings, which I also find really gratifying. Those are firms that are always looking for a competitive advantage as they get squeezed by the very large firms. So I'm really happy to see that the mid-sized firms are able to leverage this technology so effectively. So where is that time savings happening? Well, concept design and ideation. I showed all of those iterations you could do in the context of Varus, and you can do those awfully quickly. So it makes sense that you're able to explore ideas much more quickly. There was a quote from one of our customers that says, I used to model, in SketchUp or Rhino, in order to render, particularly during concept design and ideation. And they said, now with your Varus software, I actually model in AI, and I use that as the basis to start to model. So they're really inverting the whole process, going from modeling to rendering, now with AI rendering to modeling. In many ways, AI rendering almost taking on the role that sketching used to have. But you can see some of the other applications there, image enhancement. I showed that example where using AI, you can upscale the whole image, make everything look a little sharper, and then even target one individual were able to make them now smile. You think about what that would take in the context of traditional workflows, having to go back to the modeling program or the rendering program, change all these parameters, maybe and find a new asset because that person wasn't smiling, or maybe going into Photoshop. This is something where you can really see why people would be saving so much time there. And then you can see video generation down there. It's only at 14%. But when we dived into that a little bit deeper, we found that a lot of the people that were selected video generation were also the ones that were saying that they were saving 10 to 15 hours per week. And I think this speaks to the fact that video generation traditionally took more sophisticated software. It took a DCC like, say, 3ds Max or something like that, and it took an expert user a lot of time, and it also took a lot of time to render. And so that's something where on multiple levels, you've started to collapse what it would take to generate a video. And so even a short video takes a lot of time. And however, when in the context of an AI video generation workflow, obviously that's really out the window. So you can see why they would be those that are on the higher side of the time savings, the 10 to 15 hours per week of time savings. Now, it's one thing to take a survey, but it's another thing to hear from a customer how this is actually starting to affect their contracts. And we had a call with one of our customer advisory boards. I'm certainly not going to name names here, but they said they now have 3 contracts that they provide to potential clients. One of them is full AI, where they will make as much use of AI as they want. Then they have a hybrid AI contract where they'll use some AI and some not. And then they have traditional contract, and they actually charge different amounts per each contract. So the full AI is actually 40% lower, and then the hybrid AI contract is 20% lower, and then traditional, of course, is just the standard fee. And they are starting to see a preference cascade on the part of clients choosing the full AI and the hybrid AI contracts, which I think is really fascinating. One is that there was demand for multiple contract structures, but also that the use of AI is so significant that they can charge a whole different fee structure and still be increasing their revenue. Um, Despite the fact that they're taking showing a pretty significant discount with these various contracts. So that probably begs the question, well, how do architects feel about AI in their practice? It's not so great to have to necessarily cut fee. But at the same time, that I think it's a technology that's here. It has to be, you have to accept it to some degree. So now there's a question of like, well, what does that mean in practice, and how do people feel about AI and potentially the pressure to adopt it? And I think for most people that aren't using AI, they are feeling an existential pressure to adopt it. And I think it makes sense. If you're seeing people save a significant amount of time, be able to offer contracts that are going to significantly undercut you, there is going to be pressure to adopt this technology to allow you to compete. But for some people, they're still waiting to see if there's going to be value. And right now, they're still taking a wait and see approach, which is quite interesting. And I think that makes sense, because certainly adopting AI tools without necessarily having a clear plan for how to implement them or where you think they're going to start to save time can lead to a lot of messiness when it comes to that initial adoption curve. So taking that wait and see certainly makes a lot of sense. But there's no doubt that for a lot of people, there's real pressure to adopt AI. And I think it's because those early adopters are seeing so much benefit already. So for those that aren't using AI, what I thought was interesting is to look at, why not? And one of them is that they're finding that AI adoption is costly, and that's something that wasn't really the case until a little bit more recently, where the tools started to get, frankly, a little more expensive, and then also the level of computation they offered started to get more sophisticated. And with that increasing level of sophistication of computation, producing these incredible photoreal images, videos from images, things like that, is starting to use a lot of credits and incur a lot more cost. And so that's something where I think for a lot of people, they're a little concerned that could spiral out of control very quickly. So I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think for those that are starting to actually use it more, they're starting to see ways to manage those particular costs. But for those that are actively avoiding it, there's also a group that have ideological reasons as well. There's still concerns about it cheapening the profession, and I think this gets back to that earlier slide about how people are starting to have contracts that use full AI, and they're at a lower fee. And that is frankly cheapening the profession. I think there's a question of like, well, are we using AI just to get the work out the door with a lower level of quality? And I think that's something where seeing this show up as such a high level of concern is in some ways actually gives me a lot of faith and confidence in the profession. Designers really take what they do quite seriously, and I think not cheapening the profession should be a goal from everyone, from the tool developers on down to the actual practitioners themselves. Um, but there is still a concern for those that don't want to use AI and or are considering using AI. It's this accurate or misleading output. So I think this gets down to that cheapening of the profession question, which is inaccurate results and misleading outputs um, do exactly that. And particularly if like I say, an architect who has a responsibility for everything that goes out the door and accountability to the client, if they're starting to produce things that aren't buildable, aren't necessarily reflective of what the client will get at the end of the day, that's a serious problem. And so you can imagine that having results that are inaccurate or misleading can be a serious issue. And that is indeed one of, I think, the reason why it's the number one concern when it comes to AI outputs. But there's also this component here around ethical issues around originality or authorship. 26% of the people felt that was a major concern, and that makes certainly a lot of sense. But what's fascinating is that ethical concerns have decreased dramatically over the years that we've been doing that survey. So in 2024, the first time we asked about that, 74% of people had a serious concern regarding the ethics of AI. The data that was used to train, the security of the data that they've uploaded. And amazingly enough, only 26% now are concerned about ethical issues. So talk about a dramatic decrease. But what I find a little bit disconcerting here is frankly, maybe that familiarity has reduced anxiety, but it doesn't mean that risk isn't there. And sometimes you have to name names, but these are EULAs that are out there. You can go to these terms of service and find them for yourself. But here's an example where a competitor software says you grant them a worldwide, royalty-free, transferable, sub-licensable, and assignable license to use your AI content. That's something from our perspective, it would be a non-starter. Like, we don't claim ownership to the outputs you create in any of our tools. Like, no, we just don't. And it's amazing though that because of that lack of concern that people have, that dramatic decrease as they've become more familiar with AI tools, they've ignored some of the things that actually can be done with their data, which from our perspective at least does represent a pretty significant risk. So what are some key takeaways? 60% of the firms are actively using AI. If you're in that 40%, I would definitely recommend you should at least experiment. And if you're in that 60%, keep charging. This technology is not standing still, and you really want to stay on the forefront of it. The time savings aren't necessarily universal. We saw mid-sized firms are seeing the biggest benefit. Those that are using particular types of AI, like say image to video generation, are seeing the biggest time savings. But 86% of AI users are seeing time savings. So if there's ever a incentive for those 40% that are holding out, that hopefully would be it. And then that last piece around the ethical concerns, I still feel like those concerns are valid. So it's surprising that it's dropped so much, but it's one of those massive shifts. And I think about what are some of the key takeaways. That definitely was for me. So with that, I would say maybe we'll switch over to some questions. I think we have a little bit of time.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about the infinity mirror, everyone, by the way. There we go.
Thank you, Roderick. Really great insights as always. We've shared in the chat, we've shared the link to the report, so you can find all those statistics and findings and read through at your leisure as well. We have had a very lively chat, which is always the case with AI.
But this one though, I really feel like, especially showing those time savings. Like there's someone on LinkedIn who took me to task quite rightly. I was like, wow, you can save so much time. They're like, yeah, but what? I'm just working harder. And it's like the hamster has to run more on the wheel. I mean, that doesn't sound fun. So I imagine there's some comments along those lines in there.
Yeah, the existential questions continue. Well, probably continue for some time around AI in architecture. But yeah, we got so many great questions. Probably some of them, maybe I'll share some of them with you afterwards, and you might be able to answer some via email, because I don't think we'll get through all of them in 9 minutes. But
yeah, I'm sorry about that. I didn't think it was going to take that long.
It's totally okay. Inevitably, this topic gets the most questions probably of any that we do, so it's always inevitable. We got a couple of good ones though we can cover right now. Brendan Wallace asks, small firms often win projects based on unique design voice. What specific strategies do you recommend for small practices to ensure AI tools amplify their unique aesthetic rather than producing averaged out architectural visuals? I think it's a really good question, because we're all worried about AI kind of giving us the generic result in the end, which is good, but not not unique or great. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that kind of routine.
Absolutely. So I think one of the big things is start to use these tools in combination. Use a combination of a traditional tool. Like we have, for instance, we put Enscape and Veris together so that people can model an Enscape and then use Veris. And I think that's the kind of hybrid workflows where you start to see your design intent come through. But what the AI does is it sort of bumps it up to that next level of visual quality, but still stays 100% true to your design intent. And I think that works much more effectively than, say, just going from a viewport image to an AI. Because once you start doing that, there's a lot of assumptions made about materials, a lot of assumptions made about the type of lighting that you may want, things like that. So I would recommend using the combination of two tools, traditional rendering and AI, if you really want to have something represent sort of your design language. And then the other thing is take advantage of the AI capabilities. Like in our tool, you can upload multiple images that can be used as references. You can even say what kind of reference it is. Like this is a reference actually for lighting. This is a reference for materials. And that material reference can actually be a full mood board from your project, saying like, this is the counters, this is the flooring, this is the ceiling. And each one can be tagged, and it'll actually associate those specifically with that AI image, bringing it up to that next level of photoreal quality. So there's a lot of capabilities that you can take advantage of to make AI yours. And I think a lot right now, there's still people that just kind of push the button. And that does a disservice when it comes to avoiding that generic look. And then we found the same thing with Enscape, honestly. There's a lot of people that loved Enscape, but they just hit render and they're like, wow, this looks a lot like the other person's. Like, well, yeah, of course it would.
Yeah, I think that, from the beginning, even with just text in ChatGPT, it's, we've been taught garbage in, garbage out. Good content in specific content in and materials. I think that was a great point about uploading or curating a mood board outside of any application and then using that as a reference as a
great, just wild how effective that works too, because then you can get like things like this wallpaper. You're not going to find that in a material library somewhere. Well, maybe you will, but yeah.
No, it's a great point. The input being kind of probably as significant as the output with all of these tools. Stephanie Burney, sort of zooming out a little bit to the existential questions again. Stephanie Burney asks, I'm curious about how younger architects who have traditionally learned by doing will acquire the expertise necessary if AI is replacing the work that is integral to the experience base.
I think this is a big problem. I feel like the people that get the most out of AI are actually those that have experience. And that's like one of the most unfortunate parts here is that you need to be the critic to that overeager intern, right? AI is the overeager intern. Well, who can really harness an overeager intern? It's a designer with experience. And so I think that's one of the things that does concern me. And I don't have a solution to it other than to say probably in the context of educational practice, there needs to be a real prioritization of people learning the fundamentals of good design, and so that they can critique AI. So you think about what are the obligations of a school? That's 100% what the obligations are, I think. So I would say in some ways, it's going to put even more stress on educational practice to maybe not worry so much about the things that AI can do really well, but more about um, the fundamental aspects of understanding architecture so they can be the critic. They can be that quality review for an AI output. So everything from understanding composition, materials and things like that, to also understanding some of these fundamentals of building physics. So you can say, okay, no, that's not water's going to get in there. And I think that's one of the pieces where, right now, at least it seems sometimes architectural education wants to train everyone to be the next Frank Gehry. And maybe they need to focus on a little bit more of the fundamentals of architecture. It's a little more buttoned down, so that they can be, like I say, the careful user of AI.
Yeah, I think architect as director and producer, kind of bringing a lot of things together. Yeah, I think it's hard, right? Because everything is moving so fast. So I do feel for university professors in this moment
I
as
know
well.
everything is moving fast, but the fundamentals are always still the fundamentals. There's some it's not like AI is changing what the building is, right? It's a different way of getting to that outcome.
Right.
So you still need to be able to own the outcome, as they say, right? And you can't own the outcome if you don't understand the fundamentals.
That's a really fantastic point. Yeah. What was important to us, light, space, comfort, the experiential qualities of architecture remain. So yeah, I think it's a really great point to keep in mind. Amalia asks, how would you make the shift in introducing AI into an architecture firm? How long do we have to play around with it in order to actually learn how to manipulate it? And I saw a lot of discussion around this in the chat too, around, how can you integrate these tools into a practice that's already, midway through dozens of projects, and there's kind of trying to kind of plug in AI into like a moving vehicle, if you like. And somebody mentioned they're setting up like a sandbox environment, a kind of experimental space, which I think is like a really great idea to kind of start experimenting, in a lower risk way, perhaps, outside of, the current client projects. But yeah, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that, how to kind of begin.
We've done so two things I'd say. One is that's absolutely the right approach, and we do that even as a company ourselves. The context of we have to use AI tools in the context of software development. I mean, if you're not, you're behind the ball, and that's exactly what we do. We create a sandbox environment that allows for us to explore and use these tools in a way that isn't pushing our production code base, and things like that, because that could be dangerous. But at the same time, one of the key things we've also found is that you can start with some of these small capabilities that have a very known quantity and get comfortable using them. So that's one of the things that's nice about having, say, like, Adobe integrated AI tools. Like, it's Adobe, you kind of know what you're getting. Same thing with Chaos. Like, we have already sort of pre-digested the application for some of these. So for a lot of people, they don't have to set up their own environment in order to run these tools. They don't have to get new accounts. It's all part of what they already use. It's already part of the workflow. Like the material generation, it's like, well, you go to our Cosmos material library, and there's the material generation, AI material generation. It's all part of the workflow. So I think for a lot of people, just trying out these capabilities, these features, and then seeing if they have value is the first one. But as you want to go more sophisticated and start doing things that are really starting to get out there, like, like train your own LoRa, for instance, here to actually create your own images that look exactly like your firm's brand and things like that, definitely a sandbox environment. But I'd say the integration of tools into what people are already using today means that you can just start experimenting, I think, in a smaller scale. Now, one challenge is that if you're already in a project that's underway, you want to create visual consistency. So I think you do have to be a little conservative on that particular example. But on new projects, I would just jump in honestly, and be that critic. If it doesn't look good, ask why, iterate, find out what the improvements are. But I think all of us are experienced enough to know what we want, and should be able to manipulate all these AI tools to get to that outcome.
Yeah, fantastic takeaway. I think there's these tools that are integrated into those existing software applications that we know and we trust, and that's probably a
low
great
threshold start.
Yeah, and and then there's the more experimental stuff can come down the road.
Don't worry about. I mean, honestly, it's all marginal gains too, right? You'll probably get 95% of the benefit, and almost none of the work if you just do the stuff that's integrated. And then you want that last 5%. It's a huge amount of effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. We're right out of time, but thank you again, Roderick, for another really insightful webinar. Thank you for collaborating on this report.
Oh, it was a pleasure. We always like working on these with you folks.
And I'm really excited to see what comes next, and get even more kind of into the question.
I know. I cannot wait till the next survey. Honestly, I'm really excited. I know maybe people can throw in some questions in the chat that they'd like to see for the next round.
Absolutely. Yeah. We'll definitely return to this topic soon. So make sure you respond to the next survey and come to the next webinar when you can. And yeah, until next time, Roderick, thank you again. And yeah, we'll see you all very soon. Bye for now, everyone.